It's time for Fact or Fiction, Hand-Dyed Yarns edition. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Gamer Crafting podcast. I just recorded an entire podcast on the wrong screen, so I'm having to re-record the entire thing. This is what sick head cold brain does to you. Okay, let's try that again. Take two. So today's podcast, we will be talking about myths about hand-dyed yarns. I have crowdsourced from other indie dyers and well-known people in the hand-dyed yarn community to see what their biggest bugbears are about seeing myths kind of swirling around in Facebook groups and on Instagram. We are here to put some of these myths to rest today. Let's get started, shall we? So our first myth comes from Suzanne of Green Lambkin Yarn, and that's the myth that hand-dyed yarn skeins should look identical. No. Suzanne is so correct in that they're not ever going to look identical. The key is in knowing that it's hand-dyed yarn. Commercially produced yarn where the stripes or the variegated colorways always look the same, no matter what, that's typically painted on by programmed robots. While sometimes I might wish that I was a robot, might get a bit more done, I am in fact a fleshy, mortal human being. And thus, even though I have very scientific, specific dye recipes, as do most indie dyers, in many cases down to the 1/8 of a gram of knowing how much dye and acid that you are using, and techniques and everything, there's no two skeins that are going to look alike. Even skeins that are dyed in the same pan together at the same time are not going to look identical. If you're wondering how to then mitigate that, if you're trying to knit a bigger project or a garment, key is to alternate your skeins. I know that it's irritating. I know it's more work having to ball up 2 at the beginning of your project instead of 1 and just casting on immediately, but trust me, it will be worth it in the end, I promise. When I was knitting myself something a while back, I was using 2 skeins of my own hand-dyed yarn, and you know, I didn't alternate because I thought, that'll be fine. You can see where I switch skeins, and it irritates me to this day. So if you're looking for ways to mitigate, just alternate it. I promise it'll be worth it. It's going to look amazing when you're done. Just alternate your skeins. It'll be fine. I promise. Because no two skeins are alike. Because we're humans. Fleshy humans. Our second myth comes from Rox of the Lollipop Guild Yarns, and that is that single or mini skeins are pointless. They're not pointless. How is yarn pointless? It's not pointless. 20 gram mini skeins, which are probably the most common, that's enough for contrast heels and toes on a pair of socks. And as far as your beautifully dyed single skeins, there's loads of single skein projects out there. Hats are typically single skeins, mitts, lots of things. Using it as a splash of color in a wider project, if you were knitting a garment, you can have a nice splash of color somewhere. And let's be real, there's tons of patterns and projects that allow for single skeins of yarn. Single use. Oof. There's tons and tons. I can't even begin to name them all because there's loads. Shawls, garments, accessories, just there's loads to choose from. So to say that a single skein of yarn is pointless is, wrong. Our third myth comes from Samantha of Faded Yarns, and that is that you can knit straight from the hank. Don't do that unless you want to meet, as she called it, Frankenskein. Or I guess we could also call it Hankenstein. Whichever one you like better. Frankenskein or Hankenstein? Hankenstein? Okay, enough wordplay. I clearly can't handle it today. So while some people I'm sure will say, oh no, I always knit from the skein, I never ball it up, it's fine for me. And you have maybe superhuman powers. For the rest of us, fleshy mortal humans, there's a theme today. For the rest of us fleshy mortal humans, it's really a much better idea to either cake or ball up the yarn before you start using it. Otherwise, you're just gonna end up in a mess. Untangling 800 meters of lace weight is not how you want to start a session of knitting or crocheting. It's just bad plan. Please wind things up. If you're looking for ways to wind things up that doesn't require an umbrella swift and a yarn winder, you could enlist the help. You can enlist the help of a friendly person in your home to hold the yarn like so while you ball it up. You can also have the yarn looped around your knees with your knees sitting up to your chest as you ball it up. You could do it around the backs of 2 chairs. There are many ways that you can do it without needing an umbrella swift and a ball winder, all of which that I have used, even though I actually do own a swift and ball winder. People who live downstairs from us recently had a baby, and my ball winder makes a lot of noise because it's old and decrepit. So I try to not use it that much because I'm always afraid that I'm like unintentionally irritating these new parents that live in the apartment beneath us by my like loud cranking of the ball winder, and it's like loud plastic gears. So, sometimes enlist, a friend to hold it, wrap it around your knees. You'll be fine, but definitely wind it before you start or you're gonna be in a world of pain. Our next myth comes from Eva, who organizes the Perth Festival of Yarn, which is in September this year. And that is that variegated is not self-striping. Well, that's what she said. The myth is that variegated should be self-striping. I've seen it in a lot of Facebook groups and where people will say, I bought this yarn and it's not striping, the dyer is terrible, never buy from them, and it's like, whoa, let's chill out for just a second here and think about what we're saying. The thing is that variegated yarn and self-striping yarn have wildly different dye processes. If a yarn is self-striping, the dyer will definitely tell you because it takes loads more work. Mondo more work. For you indie dyers out there who dye self-striping yarn, hats off to you because that's so much work. I can't even imagine doing that regularly. I actually took my hat off for you. You're welcome. So that's the thing, is that there's loads more work involved in dyeing a self-striping colorway, which is why they're typically a little bit more expensive than other variegated speckled tonal colorways, because there's a lot of more processes involved where you're like winding the yarn around these boards and then hand painting and then winding them back into cakes or skein them up, and oh my god, it's so much work. So if you come across a skein that looks like this is the lovely Vampire Queen colorway, by the way, in case you're wondering. This is not self-striping. It's not. This is a variegated yarn. Variegated yarns are lovely and fun. They're fun to dye and they're fun to knit with, and it's fun to see how, if any, they'll be pooling or whether it's gonna, they're fun. They're fun. It's not self-striping though. If you knit something with a really small circumference, for instance, a pair of socks, as this is a sock yarn, you'll get kind of what I tend to refer to as micro striping, which usually means you'll get maybe like a round and a half before the color will change. But it's not meant to be a self-striping yarn. So if you see yarns that look like this at a yarn show, it's not meant to be self-striping. The dyer will tell you if it's self-striping because it's loads more work. It's loads more work, and they're going to want you to know that they spend loads more work putting into dyeing a lovely, gorgeous self-striping yarn. Because for me, oof. The only time that I'm ever going to end up dyeing self-striping yarns is on those big 6 meter, those big 6 meter skeins. And yeah, and then nobody wants to wind them up because they're huge. They're mammoth. I don't want to wind them up. I would just let you all wind them up. Good luck. Next on our myth list comes from Marie of MintBee Yarns, and that's that superwash means boil wash. Superwash does not mean boil wash. Here's the thing, while you could throw your hand-knitted socks in with the other things that you are putting on a mega hot wash in your washing machine, the yarn will probably survive. The yarn will probably be fine. The colors, on the other hand, will probably end up a bit faded, because when we dye yarn, we're creating chemical bonds between the dye pigments and the yarn. But if you're using mega hot water and strong detergents, you're going to break some of those bonds, which is why you end up with faded colors. And that's kind of a bummer. So most of us would recommend to hand wash in cold water, but obviously it's your choice. If you want to fling it in the washing machine, then that is your that's your adventure. And Marie also wanted to point out that washing machines, even if you're doing them on a gentle wash, sometimes things happen in the washing machine that you can't control. It's fine if you're throwing t-shirts and jeans in there, but if you're throwing your nice hand knits in there, it could snag on something. It could snag on something else that you've put in there with it. You know, if you had something that had a buckle or a pin or a button, you don't know what happens in the washing machine. It's got its own crazy mysteries. It could catch on your hand-dyed yarn, it could snag it, it could pull a hole, it could do any number of things. So, you know, maybe not risk it. It's up to you. I mean, I'm not your mom. You can do whatever you want. But I would say that if you are going to throw your hand-dyed yarns into a super hot wash, be prepared that there might be some fading, sadly. Our next myth comes from yours truly, although I'm sure all the other indie dyers also have this on their list of bugbears. It was just already on my list when I asked everyone else. And I see this all the time. All the time. I see this all the time. In groups and on Instagram, and I hear it, and it's all the time. And that's that if you have a yarn that's leaking dye, to give it a vinegar bath. Listen, vinegar isn't going to do anything on its own. In order for yarn to set dye, you need the acid, i.e. the vinegar, the acetic acid, and you need heat. And you can't just have vinegar and expect that that's going to fix it. It's not. You need vinegar and heat. If that's even the problem, it's not always the problem. Sometimes there's something called crocking, where a weird thing can happen with superwash yarns, where basically the dyer will kind of get a false positive when we rinse the yarn and it runs clear, and then weird magical science things happens. I won't get into it here because it's a big long explanation. I'm a big old geek and I'll go on about it for like 20 minutes and then you'll all stop watching. Anyway, a thing called crocking can happen, and in that case it may not help to even give it a vinegar bath and heat it. And heat. You cannot just use vinegar. You need heat too. Sometimes that won't even fix the problem if excess dye was used in the beginning, and you know, like there's a finite number of how many dye particles will bond to the yarn due to the nature of chemical bonds. You know, covalent and all that chemistry stuff that we've all forgotten. Well, it actually matters when dyeing yarn, and sometimes if there's just too much dye and the yarn physically, like chemically, cannot hold any more dye, no amount of vinegar and heat will change the fact that it's bleeding dye. Honestly, I've heard of that happening maybe once or twice. Most indie dyers, we know what we're doing. We know how to check for things. We are up on it. And if you do come across a yarn that is unusually doing things, then I don't know, just shoot us an email before like blasting us in Facebook groups. That leads us into our next myth. Our next myth is that no hand-dyed yarn should bleed color ever. No, there's a lot of reasons why. So first of all, indie dyers, we'll dye yarn, and then we rinse the yarn, and then we say, right, this yarn is no longer bleeding color. We will now dry the yarn, and then twist the yarn and label the yarn, send out the yarn. The thing is that there are some colors which will always and forever bleed a tiny bit of color, and they're known. They are known offenders, and it's usually like the neons and the super deep saturated blues and reds. They are, you know, that's just kind of how it is. So no indie dyer is going to knowingly send out a skein of yarn that is like bleeding profuse amounts of dye. If you come across a yarn that is doing that, I don't know, shoot us, like I said, shoot us a message. It could be something weird has happened. Like, if your water hardness / softness is wildly different from where the dyer is located, sometimes that can cause the bonds to break, the dye bonds to break, and the color to bleed. Sometimes that can happen. It's not super common, but it can happen. So, you know, just be careful when you're washing your hand knits, you know. Don't use really strong detergents. Don't use super hot water, because like I said, that'll make it worse. And there are some colors that will always bleed a little bit. It probably won't be very much, but, you know, just keep that in mind. Listen, when we send out the yarn, we have rinsed it and it has run clear. But like I'm saying, chemistry is a wild and mysterious magical thing. And sometimes there are things that can affect that, like temperature of the water you're washing it in, like hardness or softness of the water you're washing it in, etc. So just keep that in mind. And if you have a yarn that's like, you know, eking a tiny bit of color when you rinse it or when you go to block it, just, you know, don't think that the dyer is terrible. We all have nightmares about that, by the way. All of us. And the last thing that I have on my list of hand-dyed yarn myths is kind of a thing that all of us have mentioned at one point or another. And that's knots in yarn, which I realize is more of a yarn thing and maybe not necessarily as specific a hand-dyed yarn thing. But here's the thing, if you find a knot in your skein, 3 knots per 100 gram skeins is the industry accepted standard. That's what most mills will consider acceptable. Most of us will get yarn from suppliers where they won't have more than 1 or 2, depending on the supplier. I mean, none of us are sending out yarn that has loads of knots in it or anything, but if you find 1 single knot in your skein, it's nothing to get upset about. It's fine. You can either, like, undo the knot, rejoin. If it's not a super wash, you can do a spit splice, you can do a Russian join, you can do all kinds of different ways to just join that yarn back on in. But I mean, to check every single skein of yarn for how many knots it has would take an immense amount of time, and then we'd have to charge even more for hand-dyed yarns, and none of you would like that. So anyway, point I'm making is that none of us are knowingly sending out hanks of yarn with tons and tons and tons of knots in it, but 3 is the industry standard, and, you know, that's kind of... And here's the thing, right? It's not even just about it being an industry standard. It's not because anyone's trying to get away with anything. Yarn is spun from wool. Wool comes from sheep, obviously. And the thing is that if we were to say, oh, well, you know, this skein or whatever is 100 grams and there's no knots in it, great. The next skein, well, you've got, you know, 50 grams left of this bunch of wool and 50 grams, you know, do you know what I'm saying? You'd end up with a lot of waste. You would end up wasting loads of wool because you'd say, oh, well, that, you know, these other amounts, you know, just end up getting discarded because they're not going to make a full-size skein of yarn without a knot. So that's totally, it's not feasible at all to say that, you know, a yarn would have no knots in it at all. And to be honest, I've never really seen that being a major issue with hand-dyed yarns anyway. But, you know, I'm just saying, we can't control everything, much as we may try. I'm just saying, some of us are a little bit type A. Okay, so that concludes this video of myths about hand-dyed yarn. The take 2, because I recorded it wrong the first time. I am going to go and drink some herbal tea and take a nap after I edit out the millions of throat clearing and mess ups in this video. Hooray! Thanks everyone for watching. Please do like and subscribe if you like these kinds of videos. I will be back next Tuesday with another video. And we always do Saturday night live streams at 9 p.m. We're in British summertime now. BST. We will be back on Saturday night with a live stream. We play games and we chat about yarn and we talk about fun stuff, and it's a good time. Do come and join us, and I will be back next Tuesday with another pre-recorded video. Thanks for tuning in, and see you soon.